Drew here, and I have to be honest and say I found the season finale of Chapelwaite. It hasn't been announced whether there would be a second season or not, but I have to imagine this is a limited series. But I found this finale to be very, very underwhelming. I think that there are three primary reasons for this. First, I think Stephen King's stories, I know that this is based loosely on a short story, but incorporates a lot of elements from the novel Salem's Lot. But I feel like it very, very much takes so much influence from Stephen King that it basically, for all intents and purposes, is a Stephen King story. But people struggle to know how to end Stephen King stories. I think this has always been the case. Stephen King struggles to know how to end Stephen King stories. When you know his writing process, how he starts a story with a premise and then doesn't really outline and just writes as long as he can and just ends it when he runs out of gas. I feel like that's pretty much what happened here with this show. Like, the writers started with a premise, wrote as much as they could, and then kind of ended things when it ran out of gas. And I think you can see this in the way that a number of plot lines wrapped up, and it really didn't feel as though there was any thought put into how these plot lines would wrap up in advance. But second, I think that it was a really big problem for this series that the vampires ended up being so unintimidating at the end. Basically, I don't understand why anyone would be afraid of these vampires, because they're averse to weapons. They can be killed in any number of ways: stabbed through the heart, decapitated, set on fire. They can't go out in daylight. And on top of that, they don't seem stronger or faster than humans. Now, I think in Salem's Lot, it was mentioned that it's basically impossible to kill a vampire at night. It was only during the day that you had a chance against them. But here, it seemed like there were basically equal numbers of people from the town and vampires, and the people from the town seemed to give about as good as they got. And ultimately, Stephen and Jacob were defeated really, really quickly in the first 15 minutes of this episode, and there wasn't a whole lot of creativity in the way that the main characters took them out. It was just like, oh yeah, here we are, we're going to use the weapons we have at our disposal, crosses and other implements, and we're just going to take them out. There wasn't any real strategy that I could see. They just had a grappling match. So to me, the fact that they were taken out so easily and that they turned out to not be that powerful after all really, really diminishes the horror of the series, because you feel like we were building up to this confrontation with these entities of evil that is going to be really, really, dangerous, and the main characters are probably not going to make it out alive, but then really they weren't that dangerous. But the third problem, I think, is the biggest problem, and it's simply this: that the series did not follow through on a lot of its plot threads. I can think of numerous examples. The most obvious to me is Minister Burroughs, how he had this child with Faith Pringle, but then we find out it's actually Jacob's child, but then Faith Pringle dies, and then Minister Burroughs dies. So there's no one left alive of the protagonists that cares about this child. But then Jacob dies, and we never see the child again after Apple Girl takes the child away. So what was the point of the child existing? Further, what was the point of Faith Pringle and Minister Burroughs? None of these characters added a lick to the overall story when it was all said and done. I think that's the most obvious example, but there were other plot threads that got introduced that never really went anywhere. Why did they bother establishing that Rebecca's father was actually alive if he really wasn't going to play into the final denouement? All that happens with him, Rebecca tries to convince him to help the vampires, to help the humans defeat the vampires. He does say one important line:
I feel as much as I choose to.
Which I think plays into the themes of the story a little bit. But other than that, it didn't really change anything for Rebecca. She stays on the side of good. She never really wavers in that. And you see it all over again with, Constable Dennison and Mary Dennison, where it's they kept her alive for a ton of episodes only to kill her off seemingly capriciously. And then this episode, he heroically sacrifices himself and expresses the wish that he will be rejoined with his wife in death. But really there was no character arc for Rebecca or Constable Dennison that got worked out through these situations. So what was the point? It really didn't amount to much, and these characters' inclusion in the story didn't really amount to much. Rebecca particularly I found frustrating because her whole point at the beginning was you felt like she was going to go through some kind of character growth where she starts out the story as someone who's looking for the best story and she's willing to manipulate and lie to get it. But by the end of the story, she's decided that she's in love with Charles, and as he goes off to sacrifice himself, that she's going to take care of his kids. Like, there's no connective tissue between her initial desire and her last desire. It didn't make a lick of sense for the character to end up doing this at the end of the story. Charles, again, this isn't necessarily, some people won't be bothered by this, but he was a completely static character. He starts out as someone who's worried because of what happened to him as a kid, that he's going to hurt his own kids. And at the end of the story, he is still someone that is worried about hurting his own kids, but he makes the ultimate sacrifice to protect them. But he was willing to do that at the beginning of the story. He was considering having himself committed to an asylum. So he never really grew or changed over the course of the story. He was always the strong, resolute man of action who would do anything to protect his children. My frustrations with the final confrontation that's been building up to for 10 episodes, it happened way too quickly. We never got to see the worm, which I think would have been really, really interesting, and it was something that it seemed like we were going to get to see because it's been built up to, but no. And then the people of the town, like I said, in this final confrontation with the vampires, they're able to kill most of them way too easily. I think there might have been some budgetary constraints that played into the way that this episode went down. I certainly think, the fighting was fleeting and over with almost before it started, so you kind of felt like they basically didn't have a whole lot of budget for action scenes there. But I did like the special effects shots as the moon swallowed all the light in the sky. I thought that those were well done. It seemed like there should have been a special effects shot when Charles closed the book and reversed it. I felt like it was odd that they instead just showed a close-up of Rebecca's face as the light slowly casts itself over it, and they don't actually show the light coming out of the moon and entering the sky again. I feel like maybe budgetary reasons, they didn't have enough money for that effect shot. I also felt like they should have shown the vampires burning up when the sun came back out. Like, I get it, it's been really inconsistent throughout the story when people will catch fire and when they won't. I don't understand for the life of me why Loa and Charles are not catching fire at the end. But it seems like if his plan is to commit suicide and thus make the book vanish, then it's a good plan. But if his plan is to go out to sea and hide the book somewhere, go to shore somewhere and then disappear with the book, then he's taken an awful risk, because I don't know why he wouldn't think he would catch fire. Another big issue I had with this finale was that by the time it was all over, I didn't understand why we needed Jacob and Stephen in the same story, because they both basically had the same goal, which was to use the book to usher in the worm god and this night where the vampires could be in power. And they both just got killed by Charles in relatively brief grappling matches. Now, I think that what they did with Loa and having her decide because of love to protect her family, that was interesting, and I think that it was important that we have that line from Rebecca's dad for that reason. But ultimately, you could argue that love didn't defeat the vampires, because if the characters had acted based on love, then Rebecca would have become a vampire to be with her dad, and Constable Dennison wouldn't have allowed his wife to be killed, and he would have sided with her to help the vampires, because that was the only way he could be with his wife. And the fact that he didn't was him choosing to not act based on love. But you do see with Charles and Loa this theme of love enabling them to overcome their desires as vampires and to do what needs to be done to protect their families. So I guess you can see it from that perspective. But it wasn't a consistently developed theme by any means. So overall, I felt like the last 2/3 of this episode, because it was only the first 15 minutes where the confrontation with the vampires happened. Overall, I felt like the last 2/3 was a lot of unnecessary melodrama. It's been established that the vampires couldn't even find the book when it was hidden in a shallow grave. So why is Charles so determined to become a vampire and to depart his family and to go to the ends of the world to hide this book when it's a, like, what makes him think that the vampires are going to know that they have it, or are even going to be able to find it once they find him and his family? What makes him think his family will be safe once he departs? They could just as easily show up and try to use his family to find the book or to blackmail him. I also felt like the ending was rather ambiguous. I don't know if it was because they were trying to leave it open both ways, that you could view it as conclusive that Charles had died and that the family would be raised by Rebecca, or if they were trying to leave it open because they didn't actually show him die, that they were trying to leave it open for a second season. It was kind of unclear to me. So the last 2/3 of the episode I didn't really care for either, even though there was some very, very good acting from Adrien, Brody, and other cast members, particularly the actress playing Loa, I thought had some good scenes. I think they asked a lot of her, and sometimes she wasn't up to the task, but overall I thought she did a pretty nice job. I thought the moment when she decided to help her father defeat Jacob was particularly well done. So those are my thoughts on the season finale of Chapelwaite for what they are worth. Let me know what you thought in the comments. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of other shows, please consider subscribing. As always, thank you for watching.